Hey, I'm Ale. I just finished my third year in Chicago. I'm a CA at this year's APDA Summer Open, and this is a lecture about being an LO and how to improve at both the LOC and the LOR. So some preliminary things. Firstly, this lecture will mostly be about the LOC. This is both because I think I have more things to convey about the LOC and because, in my opinion, it's probably the more important speech for most people's improvement, but I will touch on the LOR at the very end. Secondly, there's a lot of different ways to give LOCs. So this lecture is not really going to be about arguing for a specific approach to it or giving like very prescriptive advice about what the LOC should look like. I'm rather just going to focus on sort of universal themes that you can draw from to improve your speeches. So that common mistakes that people make and some ways to improve is going to be the bulk of this lecture. And as I said before, I'll end with some LOR notes. In terms of where this lecture is situated skill-wise. It's not going to be about the basics. So if you don't have a great grasp on those, it's probably worth it to go consult some other kinds of materials on those kinds of things. It's more specifically tailored to you. But it also won't be, I hope, too inaccessible. I'm going to hope to keep the lecture as non-trivial in direction as possible. So things that are not obvious, but that also aren't too complicated to understand. So some guiding principles of what an LOC should do. Firstly is beat PMC. And this sounds really obvious, but you would be surprised at how many LOCs that sound nominally good don't really beat PMC. By beat PMC, I mean that if the judge was to make an immediate decision after LOC about who wins the round, it would be a very clear odd ballot. I think a lot of the times people sort of read a lot of op arguments and read them kind of in parallel to the PMC, and they think that they can just build the round from that, which you might be able to, but there are two things that make it structurally more likely for you to lose. One is the gov is the last word, and two is the gov's PMC is pre-prepared while the LOC isn't. So just setting up a parallel case to the gov is usually not going to win you the round if your opponents are of similar skill to you. You just try to use the LOC's advantage, just the ability to respond to PMC immediately and to direct itself using PMC in directions that are strategic. So with that in mind, I think there's an important aspect to it, which is just that your LOC should be able to beat the PMC. Secondly, you should make PMR hard. The obvious sort of intuition of the LOC is that you should be able to make the MG hard, and this will happen if your LOC is good. But I'm trying to direct you into something that is maybe a little bit more helpful, but also less obvious, which is that the gov's case and the way they do POCs and the structure of their arguments all tend to indicate a certain proclivity towards going for certain kinds of arguments or certain kinds of collapses. And so the LOC should have somewhat of that in mind, i.e. reframing the debate so they can't go for the arguments they want to go for, or especially and explicitly covering arguments think that they are more likely to collapse on, such that the MG will have to do a lot of work to keep the PMR on that argument, something that could happen. So thinking in mind, just not just like what is hard for MG, but also what more meaningfully impedes the gov strategy in the round, I think can be helpful. Thirdly, you should set up MO and LOR collapses. This is, I think, pretty obvious. You want to have arguments that aren't like, you want to have arguments that can deal with more content being added onto them and that are round winning when expanded upon in the MO and the LOR. You don't necessarily need to do all of that way in yourself and LOC, although sometimes it can be useful. But being able to coordinate with your MO and have a good idea of where you're going with the round tends to be helpful. And this also means that you should consult with your MO about what arguments you're reading in. Your MO should ask you questions during prep about what's happening, and you should be able to answer them. Fourthly, you should diversify yourself. There should never be one path to the ballot. I'll talk about what that looks like later. Fifthly, you should force decisions. The MG should have to make certain time allocation decisions about what kind of arguments they want to spend a lot of time answering and what they want to spend less time answering. If you don't make enough arguments or you aren't putting enough depth to the arguments you make, the MG can just answer everything and do what they want. And that is just generally not a very good position to be in. Lastly, you should have an impact story. This is the thing that I think is like maybe the closest to controversial among these pretty uncontroversial principles. I think a lot of LOCs these days kind of skimp out on the impact level because I think the MO and the LOR can do it for them. And to some extent that is true, but there are two things that make me think that it's still a good idea to have a pretty in-depth exploration of your impacts in LOC. One is that it will help you speak higher because judges generally like to be explained like what your argument actually does meaningfully. And secondly, doing that impacting an LOC makes it much harder for the PMR to then answer it or weigh against it, because if it is conceded that X causes Y really bad impact out of LOC, the gov can't answer that sort of claim in PMR. Whereas if you leave it to MO, the PMR has far more room to play impact defense or to mitigate what you're going for. So I think there's strong reasons to be able to explain those in LOC. So I will use this sort of sequentially in like a time sense. So I'll start from, the very beginning when you hear case sim, and then I'll go onward from there. There are many different processes for how you prep, and I'm not going to advise you to do anything in particular. There's like lectures that are specifically devoted to prep in particular, so I'm not going to go particularly in depth into this. But here are some general thoughts about what I think prep should look like. Firstly, I tend to think you should not jump into arguments right away, and the intuition why is very, very simple, which is that the first thing you think of on emotion is probably not the best argument. You should give yourself a couple of minutes to think about the world of emotion, what actually changes, et cetera, and then hone in on that when you kind of have a sense of what you're actually talking about. Secondly, as I sort of alluded to, think about exactly what changes in the world of emotion. So this seems obvious, but I'll give you an example. Round 9 of Worlds this year, the motion was this house opposes the norm against, what is it actually? Yeah. This house prefers a world in which there was a norm against self-pity. So the natural intuition here is like, oh, wow, like the world without self-pity is a very, very different world. And there's a bunch of implications on what this does to people, how they change their lives, the way they interact with people, et cetera, et cetera. But I think what was interestingly observed by OO and Myron was that the fact that a norm against self-pity does or doesn't exist doesn't mean that self-pity does or doesn't exist. And so they were able to prove that self-pity exists anyway. The only difference is whether having a norm that allows it to be acceptable is a good thing or a bad thing. So they're thinking about exactly what kind of thing changes in the world of emotion is useful. And this comes with the incentives thing that I'm talking about, which is that most of the time, motions, especially policy-oriented ones, happen because certain people want them to happen, i.e. some constituency wanted X policy to pass. So thinking about why that might be important and why that means that the counterfactual world is actually maybe not as different from the gov world as it might seem can help you in a lot of rounds. Thirdly is POCs. So there are a lot of different schools of thoughts in talking about POCs. Some people just ask tons of POCs and kind of hope that they can get some kind of concession out of them just by asking a bunch of them. Some people don't ask any. And I think it depends. So I will give only a couple of very close certainties, and then you can kind of explore for yourself how you want to do POCs. If there's an argument that the gov might have, but you're not sure that they have, i.e. an argument that like seems to sort of be within the scope of emotion, but you're not entirely clear about, that is a gov argument, you should always ask a POC, try to understand whether the argument can be read or not. If they say it can, then you can use that ammunition if you decide to tight call, or at least you can prep them against the argument. If they say you can't, then they will often actually caveat out some of their own arguments. People often actually not that careful about this, especially if they're not running their own cases. So the question, though, I think more saliently is, what if one of these arguments is the case for op? Like, what if there's an argument that you think might be op ground, but you're not entirely sure if it's into the motion? Should you ask a POC about it? And the answer is, it depends. So if this argument is incredibly important to your op strategy, i.e. it is an argument that if you can make it, you will win the round. If you can't make it, there is actually just no way you can win an op, you should ask. And the reason why is very simple. If they say, yes, you can have the argument, then you don't need a tight call and your entire op strategy can go forward. If they say, no, you don't have that argument, then you have perfect ammunition for you to tight call with. If the argument is not in one of those two camps, if it's not like super obviously important to the op strategy, I tend to think you shouldn't ask. And the reason why is because if you don't ask and make the argument and the gov kind of like whines in MG about why it shouldn't technically be within the motion, people tend to be more sympathetic to the op in those cases, especially if you can justify it reasonably well. So I tend to feel that POCs on unclear arguments you should use depending on the situation. Obviously, these are not like hard and fast rules, but those are some ways of thinking about it. So I'll lastly address two sort of controversies about LOCs. So there's two related takes. One take is like, you shouldn't take all 15 minutes of prep because it will lead you to steer too clear of like actual debate. It won't let you adapt, et cetera, et cetera. And similarly, there's a school of thought that's like, you shouldn't actually write much during prep. You should maybe think of a few arguments and then fill them in as you need to and whatever. And if that works for you, that's fine. But I think people have tried to act like these are very, very good ideas for everyone. And to be completely honest, I disagree. I disagree for two reasons. The first reason I disagree is that if it was so much better to not prep and not write during prep, eventually people would converge towards that as like a dominant strategy, but I don't really think that convergence has happened, which seems to imply, at least to me, that either everyone is stupid or more plausibly, it actually isn't the best strategy for most LOs. And secondly, and I think more saliently, is that you can give LOCs that adapt to PMC and that are willing to abandon established arguments, even once you've taken 15 minutes of thorough prep. You just have to be flexible and have that in mind. It seems to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater to be like, well, you shouldn't prep because if you do prep, then you might not throw out your prep. Like sometimes you have to be willing to adapt, but I don't see why prepping in and of itself is a bad thing. Okay, so next thing then is some notes on general LOC structure. I think there are many different ways to do this, and some people go stream of consciousness, some people read like a billion arguments, some people read 3 very rigorous, like situated arguments, and some people are, all the way in between. I think the important thing is just to be comprehensible and do what works for you. But within that sort of idea, 4 pointers. One is that if you have framing, and we'll talk about why framing is useful and how to do it later, you should start with it. Some people do it like in the middle of their speech, and it doesn't make a lot of sense because framing should just be an overall view of the round. Secondly, you should tag response as well. What I mean by this is that when you're responding to PMC arguments or preempting them, for example, you should make it clear what you're actually answering. And the reason why that's important is because one of the primary reasons why you answer things in LOC is because if the MG drops it, then it is just conceded for the round. But if the LOC doesn't make it clear that it's a response to a certain argument, if the PMR kind of goes up and responds, a lot of judges won't be able to track the fact that the LOC actually got there first. So being very explicit about how you're responding to things tends to help. Thirdly, when you're doing cross applications, so applying one argument to another, etc., be detailed about what you mean. A lot of the times people give LOCs where they're like, this impact turns their case, and they say nothing more, especially people from more technical background. Explaining why it turns their case tends to be more helpful than just saying the words, because absent the actual explanation, it doesn't really fulfill the role of an argument. Lastly, most people, if you are watching this, should do more on case than you do. Ahmad wrote a great blog post about this. I'm not going to recap all of it, but the very, very simple intuition here is the one that I talked about earlier, which is that if you don't do a lot of on case, what you have is an op case and a gov case, and they're sort of parallel cases, and the gov will usually win that debate because they are structurally advantaged in that sort of debate. The advantage of the LOC is that it allows you to move around, to be dexterous, and to respond to PMC in meaningful ways, not just in like direct response, but also in the way that you shape your off case. And if you're not using that advantage, you're doing it wrong. So going sequentially, of course, the first thing is framing. You don't always have to frame, but you usually should. It has become increasingly big these days to like frame and read framing and read very detailed framing, especially in BP as well as APDA. People don't really know how to do it very well. They just sort of say something about the world that they think is like sort of relevant, or they like make an argument. And that's not what framing is. Framing is something very different. So my view of framing is that you are setting the sort of plane upon which the debate is being played. And you ideally are reshaping it from what the gov wants that to be. So I'll give you examples of what that might look like for both hard and soft topics. By hard topics, I mean things that are more tangible policy oriented, whereas soft topics are things like narratives, for example. This maybe isn't like the full encapsulation of all kinds of topics in APDA, and I'm playing a little fast and loose with definitions here, but bear with me. So for hard topics, here are some intuitions that will often guide framing. 1, why did X policy happen? A lot of the times policies seem like kind of abjectly terrible ideas, and you're kind of scratching your head like, is this case tight? Whatever. Sometimes it's because a certain interest group really wanted that policy, and that certain interest group is very, very powerful. And there's a way to think about that is like, okay, well, so if X policy passed because of Y is still going to exist in the gov world as well. What might Y do instead? And so trying to direct the argument, direct your thoughts in like not just like considering the gov world as just the antithesis of the op world, or a different version of the op world, tends to help a good amount, especially in debates about policies that are pretty manifestly stupid. Secondly, how does the policy get done? There's like the bifurcation between like the smart way and the stupid way. And this is all well and good, and it's all very, very important for the vast majority of motions who actually implement policy. Tends to be more important than the policy sort of general platform. But people have not really done the second step, which is to justify why a policy gets done this smart or this stupid way. Or if they do justify too generically, they're like, oh, well, like, I don't know, like politicians want to get reelected, so like policies will be good. And that's like maybe a warrant. But generally coming up with strong reasons as to why your theory of how the policy is implemented is correct tends to really direct the debate quite effectively, because often the PMC can be reliant on a different conception of the policy in and of itself. And so by winning the question of how the policy is done, you can obviate a lot of the gov's material. Lastly, under hard topics, what other actors care about this? A lot of the times the gov is very clearly writing a case that is sort of targeted about a specific actor, and they want to talk about that actor. And that can be interesting and correct at times, but there's also ways for the op to reshape the debate. I'm thinking, for example, about debates about the IMF. So a lot of debates about the IMF have to do with whether IMF loans in and of themselves are good or bad. And maybe the gov makes a bunch of claims that are like, IMF loans are really necessary to save a country from crisis. Even if they're bad, they are better than, having to default on your loans, which is just terrible for the vast majority of countries, et cetera, et cetera. This is all well and good, but it often neglects, for example, the fact that governments maybe have incentives that are shifted by the IMF existing as a safety net. And so thinking about actors that the gov hasn't theorized, so that isn't talking about right, can sort of reshape what you want to talk about in the debate. 4 soft topics. So these are things about like narratives, for example. 3 things. 1, when is the narrative used? Narratives don't just exist in the ether, they exist in the world of real world actions. What kind of actions are they influencing? Who is talking about them, etc. This is very, very important to understand what the actual margin established by a narrative is. Secondly, what narratives do they interact with? Narratives don't, again, exist on their own. They are mediated by all manner of other kinds of narratives. And the example here, for example, is like world's optus. There's this narrative, like the stigma against laziness, which was the motion, whether we should regret the stigma against laziness. And the gov, I think OG and around very correctly pointed out, I think, that even if there wasn't a stigma against laziness, there would still be strong narratives that promote the idea that being successful in your workplace is a good thing. And so the harm of there not being a stigma anymore, i.e. that people won't work anymore, is quite minimized because there are still strong incentives for people to want to pursue work and to do well in their social sphere. And so thinking about how other narratives might mitigate the impact or amplify the impact of what you're talking about can really set you up well to go into the round. Lastly, how is the narrative operationalized? What I mean by this is like, what version of the narrative is articulated? Because there's obviously many different ways it's talked about. So the stigma against laziness, for example, like one thing is like a mom telling her kid to clean her room, and one thing is like being forced to work in a factory for 20 hours and not being able to sleep. And so thinking about how does the narrative actually work, i.e. what extent of it is being implemented at any given time, is very important to be able to frame the arguments adequately in the debate. And importantly, this is the same as sort of the smart way, stupid way thing, where you have to think about why your theory of how the narrative is used is correct. I'll then talk about responding to the on case. So I already talked about how you should do this more, but there's 3 things that help. 1 is that offense matters. A lot of the times, people can actually quite easily win debates on flips they read against the on case, because MGs tend to cover the on case last. And if they don't cover some defense, okay, that's maybe not so bad because the PMR can kind of hand wave it away and probably doesn't matter all that much. If they don't respond to offense, well, they've just given the op a very, very good strategy to be able to weigh in MO and LOR and then win off of. So reading actual flips against the PMC in LOC is a good idea. The problem is that what many people think are quote unquote flips are just like 3-second word scatters that don't meaningfully do anything. So if you think the argument should win you debate, you should give it the time of a debate winning argument, which is to say you should at least explain what it is and how it implicates the PMC. Secondly, relatedly, not just for offense, don't be blippy and make things matter. Explain why they matter. Explain why the PMC preempts they'll try to use against them won't actually work when they try to do them in PMR. Because the vast majority of the time, people do the on case, and they're doing it in a way that makes it structurally unimportant. And if you aren't making it important enough where the MO and the LOR can blow it up as a concession and really beat the PMC solidly, you're not doing it right. Lastly is efficiency. A lot of the times people will either, 1, spend a lot of time saying X argument from our case answers Y, Z, A, B, C, and they'll do that like 4 or 5 different times. You shouldn't do that. If it answers it, it answers it. You should see that at the top, if at all. And secondly, is they'll repeat the same response against many different arguments. Don't do that. Say the response would be at the top level and explain why it applies to each thing. It'll save you a lot of time. It'll also make you sound a lot more persuasive. It'll help you speak higher, help you pack in more content. Next then is building a strong off case. I think a lot of the off cases I see at APDA are not very good, and there's a few reasons why. One is that they need to focus more on impact diversification. Instead of trying to claim the very biggest impact, which usually doesn't help that much because people can weigh in ways that make it difficult for you to win that impact, you should try to go for many different kinds of impacts. And the reason why is because, one, it means that any kind of defense against one impact is going to apply to all of the impacts. If you only read nuclear war and then you read mutually assured destruction, you might be in trouble. And secondly, is that it gives you more tools to weigh with in the MO and the LOR. Secondly, you should insulate your scenarios. What I mean by this is you should make arguments that are triggered only and exclusively by the change in the motion. If your arguments are things that could plausibly be triggered by a billion different other kinds of concepts, they're not very persuasive. And this is especially true, I think, for principled arguments, where there's like many different kinds of principle violations usually occur, and most principle like ideas are not, very strongly held in the real world. So either justifying why this is a unique violation of the principle, or why, even given there are other violations, that this one still matters, is very, very important. Again, not just for principles, but I think it's especially important for those. Thirdly is don't rely on specific characterizations. You may have like a really clever thought about like some kind of actor or some kind of, policy in the debate, and that can set up some of your arguments. It shouldn't set all of them up, and the reason why is because if they then beat that characterization, you have nothing left. So try to get your offense from different streams. So for example, say, here's our view of the actor in framing. Here's why our offense exists. Even if their view of the actor is correct, here's 2 more arguments. That kind of thing can really help you both speak higher, but also set up your MO and LOR in much more flexible ways, rather than having to defend the same characterization over and over again. Fourthly is break ties. The vast majority of the time, the LOC interacts with the PMC in some implicit form. If it isn't doing that, you should rework it, because LOC should at least somewhat answer PMC. You should try to do best then to do the next step and actually meaningfully prove why the LOC's analysis on a certain question is better than the PMC. And just having said it later doesn't make it better. I think revealed preference tends to help. I even acted in the past. Examples tend to help, i.e. similar situations that might, sort of lead them to believe the op. And thirdly is POCs or background, which often can drop hints about a certain act's motivations, etc. Lastly is to introduce complexity. You should introduce a lot of preempts and small complications to your arguments to make it so the MG, when they're responding to an argument, is much less able to do so effectively, or if they just read their blocks, they're not going to be able to win. So introduce links within your many 3 or 4 different warrants that are slightly different from the rest of them, such that if they can answer the general thrust of the rest of them, they still not might answer that one. Or introduce little preempts, like even if X thing happens all the time, this particular variation of X thing is uniquely worse because of Y. That kind of thing, I think, is what most separates good LOs from great ones, and it's really something you should be looking to do. Sort of pursuant to that, what makes people actually sort of bad at LOC? What are the bigger problems with LOCs? One is LOCs that never get out of the sandbox. What I mean by this is that there's a lot of, the gov obviously wants the op to have a certain debate. If they don't, then they're like probably not goving right. But the gov has a case advantage, which is they get set the case, and they get to decide what the motion is about, generally speaking. And not in motions, but in cases at the very least, that's true. And somewhat in motions too, because they get to model, for example, and they get to sort of set the tone of the debate by going first. If the op is just purely having the debate the gov very evidently wants them to have, the gov is usually going to win. So you have to try to reframe or get away from the debate that the gov wants to have, unless you plan on just like very strictly out debating them by like 4 or 5 points, which tends to be a harder route to go. Secondly is LOCs that don't create enough density. So reading only 1 or 2 warrants and like making very broad strokes general arguments, which is what might work in other formats, for example, doesn't tend to fly super well in APDA because it doesn't allow you enough flexibility to maneuver around like 5 or 6 MG responses. So creating density helps you put enough pieces on the board such that when the MG says a bunch of things, you can still beat them, or at least still contest them. Thirdly is LOCs that are too narrow. So either they're undiversified on the impact level, as I talked about earlier, or undiversified at sort of the characterization level. And both of these things are important flaws that make it much easier for MGs to create huge time disadvantages for the op. Lastly is LOCs that spend time on irrelevancies. This happens a lot for some reason. People just read arguments that are like very clearly not winning or just like really clearly cannot, be impacted to win the debate. If you're making arguments that you don't think matter, you're just wasting your own time. You should spend more time buttressing the arguments you think are good. Only make arguments you think can win the debate or that can meaningfully alter an RFD. That is a very, I think, universal rule of thumb. So how do you get better at LOC? I think the very obvious thing is just to do a bunch of them. And I happen to be a believer in the school of you should just practice things and they will tend to get better eventually. And ideally do so with good judges who can give you feedback and with different kinds of cases so you can build your fluidity across a variety of topic areas. But beyond the very obvious, here are some ideas. One is try giving LOCs with less prep time. Again, I said my spiel earlier that I think that like prep is good, but doing them with less prep time can force you to realize some of the bad habits you're doing in prep, for example, and to figure out a process that works for you better in thinking of arguments. Secondly, try different orders of the speech. These days, everyone does on case, off case. They're off case, on case. And that's good for some people. And some people might want to do the opposite order. And some people want to jump in between. Like, don't do that too much, ideally. But try different orders, try different ways of, organizing your speech. And it doesn't have to all work out, but doing it differently will make you think more about the choices you're making rather than just treating them as sort of like mechanical universalities. And lastly is to look at motions, ideally like hello motions, tends to have a bunch of them, although the majority of them are really abysmal, and think about how you would frame them. Don't even think of arguments, sure, right? Don't jump right into arguments. Think about what is the framing that I would come up with this debate as op, whether it's a soft motion, a hard motion, etc. I'll close with them on the LOR. So I think the LOR is a speech that unfortunately is not really doing much for the vast majority of LOs in APDA. They aren't really able to make it impact the debate. And so here are some pointers that I think are helpful in trying to make it so the LOR is not just forgotten. One is to synergize with the MO. Don't just copy them. The MO ideally will introduce new kinds of arguments, will sort of make it clear what one kind of collapse or one or two collapses in the debate are, and that's all great. The LOR, if it just repeats the same things from the MO, just doesn't really complicate the PMR at all. The LOR should say, look, the MO is winning the debate on this and that's all great. Here's another way to win the debate that is completely independent. Now, this shouldn't clash with the MO's conception, so synergize with them, but keep it distinct. And so that helps us so the PMR has to adapt on the fly and answer two different kinds of off ballots rather than just one. Secondly, emphasize arguments the gov can't respond to. If the LOR is a bunch of stuff, the PMR can just like say like, okay, they said that, here's my response, whatever. You will tend to lose because again, they get the last word. The LOR should ideally contain a lot of pull-throughs from LOC or spins that are difficult for the gov to get to. And that makes it so the PMR's doors are far more closed. Thirdly, I tend to think you should organize arguments that you go for arguments according to two sort of general precepts. One is how much do you have to win for the argument to work? So if the argument requires like none of the gov to be true for it to function or to win the debate, it tends to not be a great idea to put at the start of the LOR because again, anything the gov wins, any condition the gov manages to clear makes that argument either irrelevant or outweighed. So I would start with generally arguments that are completely independent of the gov or completely conceded. And secondly is how clearly do your arguments beat the gov? If your arguments are just like some kind of impact that is similar to the gov impact and whatever, you should have them in LOR at some point, but you shouldn't necessarily lead with them. And you should spend more time trying to weigh them. If an argument very obviously beats the gov, you should really start with it and really spend your time buttressing why you are very clearly winning the argument. And so the judge is sort of more led to believe, okay, the op is like really, really clear and really ahead on this question. Lastly, try to make the judge remember your speech. I think a lot of times the LOR doesn't matter at all. So try to organize your LOR with either ballots, like very explicit ballot directive language, or very clear burdens the PMR must clear. And using that kind of repetitive and explicit language makes it just far more likely to pick up on what you're trying to say. All right. Thank you, everyone. I hope this was at all helpful. And if you have any questions, feel free to like message me on Facebook or whatever. And I hope you have a fun term.